Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. You've done extremely well getting through the afternoon without an extra supply of coffee. Uh, so don't worry. There are drinks and canapes coming at 5:30. So you've got your last session now to stick it out, and then we will be straight on to that and some networking and a little bit of socializing. So thank you all so much for being here. My name is Kirsty McFadden. I'm an economist at the Fraser, and I'll be chairing this session. This is the first time I've chaired a session with 3 presenters and 3 panelists and audience participation, so bear with me. I'll try my best to keep everything organised. Today we're going to be discussing Scotland's strategy for tackling child poverty and what might be required to meet our 2030 targets. We've got a fantastic range of speakers and panellists lined up to share their expertise, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and I hope that you all are too. So a very brief background to get us all up to speed. Scotland has set legal targets across a range of child poverty measures for 2030. These include less than 10% of children in relative poverty, less than 5% in absolute poverty, less than 5% experiencing combined low income and material deprivation, and less than 5% in persistent poverty. The latest data that we have on child poverty in Scotland covers the financial year 2023-24. And this was also the year where we found out whether Scotland had hit its interim child poverty targets. We found out in March that we missed all 4 interim targets, and without further actions, we are unlikely to hit the final targets for 2030. There's a general consensus that there is quite a lot to be done. In this panel, we want to discuss not just what needs to happen, but also how it can be paid for. We've brought together modelling of different levers with budget and spending analysis to unravel this important issue. We'll be hearing from speakers from the Fraser of Allander Institute, 3 of them, and we will also follow this with a broader discussion with our 3 panel members, and we'll have some time for audience questions at the end. So to start us off, I'd like to introduce Emma Congreve. Emma is one of the Fraser's deputy directors and leads the Institute's work on poverty, inequality and inclusive growth. Emma was previously a senior economist at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and an economic advisor within the Scottish Government. Emma is an expert in economic policy relating to low-income households. She also has a background in local government finance and environmental and agricultural economic policy. Emma will be presenting some work that Fraser has been doing on tracking Scottish Government spending on child poverty action. So please welcome Emma.
Thank you, Kirsty. Oh, no, this is me. So, this is the first tranche of some work we've been doing, and Joao's going to talk about the second tranche of it later on today. And this is work that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in Scotland funded us to do. So we wanted to have a look at what we could glean on what is being spent on child poverty. When you hear announcements about child poverty policy, or you hear speeches, quite often what politicians, ministers are referring to is budgeted spend. So allocations of X million on social security, X million on a fund over here. But much less frequently, we don't actually hear what we refer to as outturn expenditure. So that's actually what was spent. You find that out at the end of the financial year when you actually go back and do the accounts, basically, to see where money has been spent. And the budgeted figure and the outturn expenditure figure can be different. I mean, not for nefarious reasons, just because things change in the matter of the year. You may have set aside a fund and then you don't have as many people applying to the fund, so you don't spend all the money. Or if it's a social security policy, you might have underspend or overspend compared to forecast. So there's lots. It's not an issue that we have differences between budget and outturn expenditure. But if we really want to know what the Scottish Government is spending on child poverty, then the best place to look is outturn expenditure. But that's not actually always that easy to find. So Scottish Government budget each year, and the Scottish Government budget documents will set out what is budgeted for the year. There has been some improvements. Actually, last year's budget did do a much better job in providing what the spend was for the previous year up until the latest outturn estimate they had. So there are some improvements underway, but we were going back to kind of I don't know, was it about 5 years? So, you know, and actually trying to find that outturn expenditure was really difficult. I'll talk about that again in a minute. So what we decided to do was we looked at the 2 child poverty strategies and the child poverty progress reports that had lists of actions. If you were in the previous session, we were talking about some of the some policies don't have action plans. Well, the child poverty delivery plan definitely does. I haven't got the count of them here, but there's an awful lot of them. And we tried to track those through into trying to find the amount of money that was spent on that action in each financial year. This list is a bit different from what the Scottish Government produce in their progress reports. They have some financial information in there, but that's under the banner of investment to support children in poverty. So the difference here is that it's not necessarily investment that will reduce child poverty. It's investment that supports children in poverty. So you can, you know, spend money on trying to make children's lives better who are in poverty, but it won't actually reduce their poverty levels. To reduce poverty levels, you need to get more money into the pockets of parents, basically through employment, social security, or help with the cost of living. So there's a slight nuance there. But again, it's, you know, that it's not the Scottish Government not trying to, you know, pretend that they are coming up with a list of outturn expenditure against actions. They very wisely label it properly. So that's good. So in order to try and find this information on outturn expenditure, and I would probably say, you know, I think it's quite difficult for anyone to do this, even inside the Scottish Government as well as outside of it. But we did try and scour lots of evaluation reports. So there was some evaluation reports that do give the outturn expenditure, as well as looking at the impact of this expenditure. There's also, we also had to look at a lot of, there's a lot of FOI responses out there with people asking, you know, how much was spent on this fund. Scottish Government has started to do a little bit more proactively in trying to get some more of this sort of data out on some funds. And by a fund, I mean, you know, you get these different pots of money that third sector or local government can bid into and then use the money to meet the aims of the fund. But on the whole, it's very patchy. We also looked at audited accounts and we included local government within some of this where we could. And local government do have to do it sort of, there's more information compiled by the Scottish Government on local government audited accounts than there is on Scottish Government audited accounts. So, so some exclusions, lots of caveats. We don't, basically, when my question, can we tell what the Scottish Government spends on child poverty? The answer was unfortunately no. So, but we want to start somewhere, and we're trying to piece something together, and hopefully over time with the work that we're doing and Joao's doing and JRF are doing, we might make progress on this. So this is where we got to. We further refined the list of actions, so we were really looking where poverty was the primary focus of what the government was spending its money on. So you do get a lot of policies that maybe appear in the child poverty delivery plans, but they're not aimed at children. Actually, no, I'll correct that. They're not always in the main sections of the child poverty delivery plan, but they are referred to as actions that will support children and help children get out of poverty. But they are they're not directed at children. That's not their primary aim. It's incidental, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. But there are lots of policies that are designed primarily to reduce child poverty, and that's where we really wanted to focus, because that's what the government's, that's what will really drive progress towards the child poverty targets. So Scottish child payment is in, you know, obviously that's a flagship policy to try and reduce child poverty, help on cost of the school day, included those. Children are the primary focus of that. It's to try and help children get more money to parents of children on low income to help with the cost of the school day. But things like carers allowance, which some parents will be carers and will get that money. Fuel insecurity fund, again, we're not including them in that primary focus, but they are in the report. So if you look at the report, we're not saying they don't matter. It's just we are trying to sort of really hone down to get some figures that show us kind of how well the government is prioritising spending on child poverty and related measures. So we do have an overall increase over the years we looked at, which is good. As you will see, a huge amount of that is in that social security block. That's a purple block there. And a huge amount of that is the Scottish child payment. So that's a really good thing in terms of that amount of money that's gone into that. But also it's, you know, it does kind of raise concerns that there's a lot of eggs are going in one basket, because there has been decline in other categories. If you look at some of the cost of living measures that we pull together, and people will dispute what we've included in and out of this primary focus, but there has been a bit of a reduction in that. I think the key thing in the cost of living, which the report talks about an awful lot and has different scenarios, is how much you include the affordable housing budget within this analysis. That's huge. But, you know, it's been designed for it's not been designed just for children. And actually understanding how many children benefit from it is quite difficult. So it's quite hard to include in an analysis like this. And some of the things on employment, you can see that's a light blue. There's quite a small amount of the sliver. But again, there's things like the parental employability funds in there, but the more general no one left behind money, quite hard for us to work out how to include that in this analysis. So lots of caveats here, but it gives you an overall view and gives us an overall ballpark of how much of the Scottish Government's total spend is kind of laser focused on meeting the child poverty targets, which is what we're here today to talk about. So we get to around about 1% of total Scottish Government outturn expenditure in the latest year for which we have that outturn data, which is 23-24. So that gives us a bit of a sense of where we are now in terms of how much we're spending. Kirsty's already outlined what we've achieved by 23-24 in terms of reducing child poverty in line with the ambition of the targets. I mean, child poverty has started to come down, and we think that's because of the Scottish child payment, but yeah, we do not appear to be on course towards the targets. I don't think that's contentious to say. And so just a quick thing, I think you'll all be aware of this, but I think when we're hearing people talk about how much is being spent on child poverty or figures are being quoted at us, I think it is good to pause and think, well, actually, what are these figures that we're being told? And we would like the government to make a clear differentiation between what's audited outturn versus estimates versus budget allocations. We think it could be a lot more clarity there, which would just help with understanding of what's actually going on. We would like to be able to work out how to include things like the housing budget and no one left behind. But we need evidence to support the extent of the spend that is going on children and going on tackling child poverty in order to be able to do that in a way that we feel is robust and reliable. So the Scottish Government do try and, you know, for some of the bigger programmes, they will try and do take a proportion that's in relation to how many children are in poverty compared to the total child population. But that's too high level, too vague. We need actual evidence of that, and that needs to be provided so that people like us can look at it and then decide how to use it. And so we would really like to be able to do that. But I think Joe will maybe come to this later, but we really need better transparency about so much of what is being spent by the Scottish Government. I can't overemphasize how frustrating it was and how many hours I spent trawling to just try and find, you know, these names of these funds that change every year, and trying to just find somebody that somewhere in Parliament maybe, or someone's mentioned it, that there might be a figure, and it just should be a lot easier than that, surely, especially for something which is the #1 priority of the Scottish Government. So that's just a bit of setting the scene, and I think I'll passing over to Hannah. Kirsty? There we go.
Thanks very much, Emma. It's really interesting food for thought, and I'm sure our panelists will pick up more on that in their responses. So I'm going to introduce Hannah next. I should also say, if you do have any burning questions for our speakers, I'll make sure that you can ask them as well. Just let us know when it comes to the audience Q&A. If you're directing your question at any one particular person, that's totally fine. So next up we have Hannah Randolph. Hannah is a fellow at the Fraser of Allander Institute. She specialises in applied social policy analysis with a focus on income, poverty and inequality. Hannah's previous work includes analysis of household time use, the future of global care work, land rights and migration in developing countries. Hannah will be talking you through some modelling that we completed earlier this year to understand how far various potential anti-poverty policies might take us. So welcome to Hannah.
Thanks, Kirsty, and thank you, Emma, for providing that context on what is currently being spent on child poverty in Scotland, to the extent that we can see what that is. So as Kirsty said, I'm going to talk a bit about some modeling that we did earlier this year to think about how we can reach the 2030 targets. And so I'll emphasize that what we've modeled is not the only path to the 2030 targets. It's not necessarily the best path, but it was one that we thought was interesting to look at. And I'll talk a bit at the end of my presentation about some other modeling that other people have done, because I think sort of going on concurrently with what we were doing, several other organizations were thinking along similar lines, and there's been some sort of key insights that have come out across those different pieces of research. And so one of the things that we were interested in is first identifying what is the magnitude of the challenge. So what do we expect child poverty to be in 2030 if we don't do anything further? And then a second piece was around how far can parents' income from work get us? So this is often part of the conversation around child poverty, is an emphasis on if we can just get parents into work, then that will make a big difference. And so we wanted to test, you know, how far does that really go? And is that sufficient to meet the 2030 targets, or is something else required? A third thing we were interested in, which I'll show a bit later, was potentially some different structures for Scottish child payment and what that could look like. So if you took a slightly more targeted approach for some of the priority households, would that make a big difference? And finally, a little bit on how much policies might cost. So we did try to do an approximate costing, and there are some other numbers out there that I'll cite as well, to again emphasize if we're talking about meeting the 2030 targets and where can we find that money, how much money are we kind of talking about, ballpark. So the method that we use for this is microsimulation modeling. And so essentially what that means is we take some survey data and we apply the system of taxes and benefits as it currently stands, and then we change something about that system and look at the difference in household incomes and poverty rates and that sort of thing between those two scenarios. So we are looking primarily at incomes and poverty rates. The data for this are from the Family Resources Survey, for those who are familiar. And we, in this piece of modeling, we're adding successive policies on and looking at their sort of the marginal impact of each additional policy, and seeing where that gets us to in terms of relative child poverty. And as I said, there are several other pieces of modeling that have gone on at sort of the same time, and so I'll come back to these at the end. But this was Joseph Rowntree Foundation had a piece come out around the same time as ours. IPPR Scotland, the Poverty and Inequality Commission commissioned a piece of work that was similar to this, and Scottish Government did their own modeling. So there is quite a lot going on in this space this year, which was exciting. So kind of first question was around, you know, where will we be if we don't do anything additionally? And so what we found was with the current policies that are in place, relative child poverty over here on the far left would be about 21% in 2030-31 with current policies. And then obviously the Scottish government has announced that they will mitigate the 2-child limit. And so we expect that to decrease relative child poverty by about a percentage point. So we're looking at about 20% relative child poverty under current and announced policy. And as Kirsty said at the beginning, the target is 10%. So we've got quite a ways to go. So the second question we were looking at was, how far does parental employment and income from work get us? And so, we looked at a few different things. So we increased the rate of parental employment. We looked at what if you increased hours for parents who are working? What if you increase the hourly pay rate for parents who are already working? And the way that we did this, so this is something that's different across different pieces of modeling that people have done, especially for employment. We were trying to look at something that we felt was more realistic. So for parents of very young children, we were looking at, if you had full wraparound childcare available, then we might expect parents of very young children to have similar employment rates to parents of primary school age children. And if you have full after school care available for primary school age children, then they might have employment rates that look fairly similar to parents of secondary school children. So that's kind of how we did the scenarios that we're thinking about when we did the employment rate analysis. And so when we put all of this together, we get about a 3 percentage point reduction in relative child poverty from things that have to do with parents working more and being paid better. So that puts us at about 17% relative child poverty, which is still quite a ways off the final target. So our conclusion from this was, the parental employment and income from work does something, definitely doesn't do nothing, but that alone will probably not be sufficient to get us to the 2030 targets. And so the last thing we looked at, so we did look at increasing the rate of local housing allowance, so getting some more support for rents primarily, and that didn't have a huge impact. And so the rest of what we're looking at is how do we fill the gap to meet the targets with Social Security? And in Scotland, the primary tool for this would be the Scottish Child Payment. So on the top here, we're looking at just the current structure, which is a flat rate per week per child. There's been an ongoing campaign to get £40 per week, so we did have a look at that in isolation. So that reduces child poverty by a further 1 percentage point. And then in order to fully meet the targets, you have to set the rate of Scottish child payment at £150 per week per child, which is an insane amount. And this is not something that people are really seriously talking about doing, but it does give you a sense of the scale of what you would need. On the bottom, we were thinking a little bit differently about how you might want to start targeting Scottish child payment. So you keep the per week per child amount, but if you also had a per household premium for certain priority households. And the ones that we chose for this were the ones that were most likely to be left behind or not affected by the parental employment and pay stuff that we did. And so with that premium alone, on top of the current amount of Scottish child payment, you'd be sitting at about 16% relative child poverty. And then in addition to that, you could set Scottish child payment at £115 per week per child, and that would get you to the targets. So again, a huge amount that I don't think anyone is really seriously talking about, but you potentially have, with that more targeted structure, then you have a little bit less further to go with the per child payment. And so we did take a crack at costing these. And particularly for the employment policies, we were thinking about you would need to have this massive expansion of childcare and you would need to provide people with employability services. And so we came up with somewhere around $5.5 billion. And this is a little bit back of the fag packet calculation. So don't take this to Scottish government and say, seriously, this is exactly what it would cost. And I know JRF have done some similar costings, at least for the employment side of things, and come up with a much lower number, I think, but still in the billions. So talking about several billions in order to meet the 2030 targets, which is quite a lot in comparison to what is currently being spent. And so some final thoughts from this and then the other work that's gone on in this area. There seems to be a general agreement that the current policies in place have offset really tough conditions for households rather than improving poverty rates in absolute terms. So if you look at a chart of the relative child poverty rates over time, it's fairly flat, which is a little discouraging because we've had the target since 2017. But based on modeling that other organizations have done, we can say that child poverty probably would have risen in that time if it weren't for things like the Scottish Child Payment. And so along with that is, we have the Scottish Child Payment, and that is a very good policy, but what we're currently doing is not enough to meet the 2030 targets. Something that also came out across these different pieces of modeling was that parental employment and income from work does something, and the scope for that to have a big impact is there, but it also has a limit. And so where rent reform could potentially help a bit, a lot of the work is left to the rest of the social security system. And so our big conclusion from this was, there's no one magic bullet policy that you can implement that's going to get us to the 2030 targets. This really needs to be a combined approach across different areas. And this is a framing from, I think, from Poverty and Inequality Commission that I do find useful. So estimates have shown about Scottish Child Payment reducing child poverty by about 3 to 4 percentage points. So in order to reach the 2030 targets, we need 3 more policies that have that magnitude of impact to get us there. So that's something that I found useful to think about, of just the size of the challenge that we're facing. And so now I will pass back to Kirsty.
Thank you, Hannah. And last but not least of our speakers before we move on to our panel is João Sousa. So João is our other Deputy Director at the Fraser, and he works on all things fiscal. Previously, he was a Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Office for Budget Responsibility, where he led on analysis of long-term sustainability of the UK's public finances and on the effect of economic developments and fiscal policy on the UK's medium-term outlook. João is presenting, as Emma said, on the second part of our work on following the money and the general fiscal landscape and where funding for poverty policy might come from. So welcome, João.
Thank you, Kirsty. As you said, I will be talking about what the Scottish government spends its money on, kind of like what I find more, and I think we find in general, and this is work that's been supported by the Joseph Rothschild Foundation as well, we all think it's a more helpful way of breaking down the budget than just straightforward, either functional or analytical classifications. You don't need to concern yourself exactly with what those are, but trust me, they can get pretty dry when you get to some of the breakdown. So we're trying to combine the two to give you some more helpful insights into what the Scottish government spends money on, but also how it raises revenue, and giving you a sort of outlook of what we can expect in the next few years, based mostly on the medium-term financial strategy that the Scottish government put out in June and the associated documents from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So this is another piece of work that looks at outturn spending. So the Scottish government has its definitions he has actually improved it somewhat in terms of looking back at the previous years and how much it has spent, but it does it on kind of what's called a level 4 budget, which is kind of program by program, but that's kind of too aggregate for us to really understand what they're spending their money on. So we want to also break it down into, what function does it serve, but also what type of spending it is. So things like, how much of it is pay, how much of it is consumption, how much is total just health spending rather than just the health and social care portfolio and the different components of that. So this is in 2025-26 prices, so real terms going back a few years. And it's just the total amount of spending by the Scottish government on day-to-day spending. I'm going to park capital for this presentation, mostly because a lot of this action is on day-to-day spending that we're looking to finance. The other thing is that the Scottish government has what is a much harder cap in terms of borrowing for day-to-day purposes than it does for capital spending. And this is data that we've been compiling based on the on local financial returns for the local government bid, which is not represented here, but also on the Oscar database, which is a Treasury released data set that includes reporting from all parts of central government, including the Scottish government, and that has a lot more of that detail. So you can see the Scottish government day to day spends about 50 billion, just over 50 billion pounds a year. A huge chunk of that is health, huge, about 40%. So when we think about, and what I'm going to step you through in these consecutive charts is just how much and how different each of the elements of the Scottish budget is in terms of size. And therefore, once you account for 5 or 6 of them, there really isn't that much left over to finance all other spending from. So Social Security, Emma and Hannah outlined, there's been a huge increase. There's been a lot more devolution of Social Security, as well as Scottish specific benefits that have been created, like the Scottish child payment. This is just total spending, so it doesn't account for the fact that there's been some additional funding that's come through the block grant adjustments, but you can see that that's really increased quite significantly. The other thing that the Scottish government does a lot is give money to local government to actually deliver a lot of these services. So education, social care, all of that's provided by local government. That's around 13 billion pounds a year. So you can see that we started with a huge red area. It's slowly being ebbed away. We're not done yet. So this is education. This is education paid for by the Scottish government. So it doesn't include schools mostly, just but what it does include is things like Scottish Funding Council. Then we have to pay for the police, which is a significant part of the budget, about £2.5 billion a year. And then we have to pay for transport, which, the things like ScotRail run on a subsidy, subsidies to other bits of public transport. This is just on the day-to-day side, so it's nothing to do with roads or building railways or anything like that. But you can see you're left with essentially about £5.5 billion to spend on everything else, which is a decent chunk of change, but there's lots of things that the government does that aren't represented here. How do things look going forward? So health, as you saw, is a huge part of the Scottish government's total spending. Not only is it the largest element of the budget, it's also the one that's forecast to grow the fastest. The assumption in the medium-term financial strategy is about 4% a year in real terms, I believe, which is kind of what has been growing at in recent years. Part of it is the aging population, but it is consuming more and more of the budget. So it's something to focus on. The other things to look out for: what will happen to the block grant adjustments for Social Security? So decisions by the UK government can have a direct impact on the financing available for the Scottish government if they are on benefits that are devolved. So when there were reforms announced to a cut to personal independence payment, that directly affects how much is available to spend directly onto adult disability payment. If the Scottish government does not wish to do the same reforms, then it has to find the money from somewhere else to pay for that. As I said, borrowing powers are quite limited on the resource side. That they're essentially just for forecast errors. This all put together means that the medium-term financial strategy that the Scottish government released in June has a that's wrong there. It says 25-26. It should say 29-30. So it's a growing annual gap reaching £2.5 billion by 29-30. I mean, there's a question as to whether that really is a central view, because it essentially assumes no prioritization. Everything is either kept the same in real terms or grows at a higher rate. But that is kind of like, you could see that as the size of the challenge in terms of balancing the revenue budget, given that, you know, if you don't do any prioritization, you're going to breach essentially your fiscal rule. And just finally, a point just to kind of set the scene in terms of the revenue raising side. And one thing that is really important to note is that the biggest source of revenue or funding for the Scottish government is still the block grant. It's about £42 billion this year. It accounts for about 80% of all revenue funding. The fiscal framework adds a bit of money to that. Now, the block grant adjustments for Social Security add a lot of that, but Scottish income tax does as well. But because there's a gap between how fast receipts in Scotland are growing and how fast they're growing in England and Northern Ireland, which are the comparable geographies, it actually only adds about 600 million in the latest forecast year, which is not a lot given all the different rates and thresholds that we have in Scotland. The other taxes are pretty small. I would say on net, they don't add that much to the budget. Non-domestic rates are a way of financing things, but they're mostly committed to being devolved to councils again. So they're collecting centrally. They're mostly just given back to councils according to a formula. Council tax could raise more money. I think that everyone's agreed with that. But I think the thing that people find really difficult about council tax and really challenging in terms of the fairness of the tax is a distributional element rather than necessarily the amount of money that gets raised overall by the system. So the willingness to reform that doesn't seem to particularly be there. We also have had quite a lot of years of freezing council tax, which because the rate increases are based on previous year's increases, means that you're forever reducing your revenue if you freeze it for 1 year, let alone if you freeze it for 10. There are other options that are often floated. So there's lots of talk about a wealth tax and whether you could implement one. And there's been suggestions of a local wealth tax. I think there's some questions about whether the devolved powers are there for some of the versions of this that are proposed. And then there are others for which the information just probably isn't there, even if you could say that you're going to set up a tax like this. And then there's some like further proposals on reform of land value taxation and all of that. And to this and to the wealth tax ideas and all of that, the one thing that I always want to raise is something that having worked at HMRC, I know fairly well how the processes work, is that if you want to change rates, you need a good lead in for those to be changed. Things take you know, for implementing a tax that's similar to another tax, it takes at least 18 months, probably more. You have to pass legislation, you have to instruct things, consult on how you're going to collect it, all of that, set up the systems. So I would be skeptical that any new tax could really be implemented in time for any spending to be done by 2030, let alone change anything to poverty rates by then. But that is my view based on my experience, and other views are available, I'm sure.
Thank you, Joao, and thank you to Hannah and Emma for your presentations as well. So I'd now like to introduce our panel, and we'll have initial responses from them to the presentations. I don't envy the three of you having to tackle all of these difficult challenges that we've just heard about, but we'll try and work our way through it together. So I will introduce the three of you, and then you can come up afterwards rather than you having to come up one at a time and it being weird and awkward. So first of all, we've got Russell Gunson, who's Head of Programmes and Practices at the Robertson Trust. It's one of the largest, one of Scotland's largest independent funders, investing over £25 million per year, focused on preventing and reducing poverty and trauma in Scotland. Until June of this year, Russell also chaired the Minimum Income Guarantee Expert Group, which proposed a roadmap for delivering an income floor in Scotland beneath which no one is allowed to fall. Prior to his current role, Russell was the founding director of the think tank IPPR Scotland and has worked in various policy, research, campaigning and influencing roles in the voluntary sector, government and parliament. Our second speaker is Suzanne Fitzpatrick. Suzanne is the director of the Institute for Social Policy, Housing Equalities Research, called iSphere at Heriot-Watt University. She is a leading international scholar on homelessness and has led several major programmes of work, including the regular Destitution in the UK publication for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. She's also a commissioner for the Poverty and Inequality Commission, an advisory non-departmental public body which provides independent advice and scrutiny to Scottish ministers on poverty and inequality. But I should say that Suzanne is here with her more of her iSphere hat on and personal hat on rather than her Poverty and Inequality Commission hat on. And finally, we've got Jack Evans, who is a senior policy advisor for Scotland for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Jack's research interests include in-work poverty, employer practice change and procurement. He recently co-authored a toolkit to help Scottish political parties shape their thinking and action to meet the 2030-31 child poverty targets. He also contributes to GRF's regular Poverty in Scotland annual report. Before joining GRF, Jack spent 5 years at the Poverty Alliance as their Living Wage Scotland manager, working with employers from all sectors and industries to help embed the real living wage in wage structures. So could you please give a warm welcome to our three panellists? Right, so I'm going to put my other mic on while one of you talks. So Russell, could I come to you first for your initial thoughts and reflections on the presentations we just had and a challenge that we are facing?
Yeah, and can you hear my mic? Is it working well? Perfect. I suppose where I want to start is that sometimes in conferences like this, me included, and in our jobs like this, we can sometimes try and create the perfect policy, the one that is absolutely brand new, no one's thought of it. And sometimes we can ignore the politics. And so I wanted to bring some of the politics in because I think that's underneath the whole heap of the implementation gap, underneath the whole heap of what we're not getting right in Scotland. Also, in a typical move, I wanted to slightly dodge the question around hence politics, right? About how do we get to 2030? I want to slightly flip it to what can we do by 2030 into a much more positive frame, because I felt a lot today well, what should we say, the ebbing of hope around what we can do. And I think let's end today at least with a bit more of a hopeful, optimistic point. And I guess what I hear from the presentations today and elsewhere is that we need a bundle of interventions over these next 5 years to get anywhere near our ambition around work, around social security, around childcare, around housing. And I guess, as again, you've heard just now, how we pay for those come from three broad areas. So tax, existing spend in devolved areas, or consequentials. And that's one that we've heard a little bit less about. So that's the money that the UK government decisions mean flow to Scotland. And the last thing I want to say is, before I get into my response, was around what we've done already. So it was skipped over slightly in Emma's presentation, but there's something amazing and phenomenal that most people in this room have been involved in, which is £650 million extra through the Scottish Child Payment and 2 child limits, focused specifically on tackling child poverty, £6.5 billion worth across the UK. That is some really incredible wins that we, have achieved and delivered. And there's loads of downsides. We're nowhere near enough. But we do need to protect our victories. Otherwise, they completely get washed away. And that's a massive thing. So the question I wanted to ask was, what if we got another 650 million over the next 5 years? What could we do with it? How far could we get? And talking through those tax, devolved spending, consequentials, I wanted to talk about the policy and then the politics just really quickly. And so the policy suggestions around that are in the ether from this room and beyond around tax, and you've heard some of them, it's replace council tax, it's bring in new local taxes, it's look at maybe tax allowances like the small business bonus or income tax thresholds. And those are really good policies, but bring politics into it and they narrow down quite substantially for some of the reasons we've heard. They take 5, 6, 7, 8 years to come in. A lot of those taxes I mentioned are some of the most unpopular among taxes, which are not exactly popular, as probably we're about to see in November from the UK government. And so what's left once you bring the politics in? Maybe reforms and tweaks to council tax, maybe the odd 50, 60, 70 million pounds here or there, maybe the small business bonus framed much more into fair work than just a giveaway without any impact as far as we can see, worth 250 million pounds a year. But I think our politics frame narrows down our policy options a little bit on tax. On spending, you've seen a relatively depressing slide about how 60 or 50 odd billion gets down to 5. Are there big areas of spend that we can free up to put towards this 650 million quid? In policy terms, you could look at health, you could look at childcare, you look at housing, education. Not sure I would if you're trying to tackle poverty and child poverty in particular. Bring the politics onto it, and oh my God, you're going to cut NHS spending when waiting lists are as they are, schools when ASN is as it is, housing, so on. So our politics probably narrows down a little bit. The hope is coming, I promise. But around consequentials, this is where I see the hope. It's what we've done over the last 5 years. It's not like we have in your face said as a country, we're going to raise income tax and put it into the Scottish Child Payment. It's not like we said we're going to cream off some of the consequentials that have come up from the UK government and put them into this 650 million pounds progress. But that is what's happened. We have quietly taken money that we've reduced the increases, if you like, in parts of the spend to the point where we can find that 650 million. Now, in my view, in policy terms, there's an option about being much more explicit, creating a prevention fund that gets into some of the Christie Commission talk from earlier, creaming off money that will ultimately benefit that spending area from health, from other places. But you don't need to do it loudly if you bring the politics in. You can do it quietly. And that's what we've done once. Let's do it again. And what does that get you? So 650 million quid in the minimum income guarantee work that we did and published just a few months ago gets you halfway there. It gets you 5 to 6% poverty reduction, child poverty. If the UK government begin to pull their weight, they don't look like they want to, they might look like they're forced to, then you can do more than that. And if we see a better work even than the last 5 years on influencing, then maybe we can go even higher than 650 million. And to be honest, the context of a really unstable minority parliament, we'd be doing a bad job if we get less out of this next 5 years than what we got out of the last. So just to introduce that hope, we don't need to sometimes have the perfect policy. Bring the politics in, and what you can see is that we've done it once, we can do it again. It may not get us all the way there, but it gets us a whole chunk of the way there.
Thank you, Russell. Some really interesting food for thought, and I really like that sort of idea of like quietly preventing. That sounds really good. So I'll come to Jack next. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, the first is an apology to our Fraser of Allander colleagues for setting them such a hard task. I think we mentioned that a few times. It seemed a lot easier on the whiteboard in the JRF office.
Is that how these things work?
Yeah. But throughout that project, I've thought about that Joe Biden quote that everyone keeps talking about. Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. And so half of that is a good story. You see that massive increase in spending in social security. is what we would all want. So we see that value they place in social security. We should all be, as Russell says, hold on to that victory, that we can celebrate social security as a positive thing and not something to be embarrassed about or stigmatized. So that's great. My area of interest in work is work and the labour market, and that is a less good story on the budget. How can't we tell what we're spending on employability? It is mad. It's such an important lever, and it needs to shoulder much more of the burden of reducing child poverty. And in the slides that Hannah was sharing, and very kindly was quite euphemistic in our kind of much more optimistic expectations of what the labour market could do, we put 50,000 parents into work and increased the incomes of a further 20,000 parents that were already in work, which basically gets you to almost full employment, but also gets you, down to about 14% of child poverty. When we costed that, again, the difference in the costing reflects the politics for us. So we did some costing on what an employability project would look like, but we didn't cost an expansion of universal ELC of childcare. Because our developing policy position there is we need a contributory system where that spending is prioritised in childcare on the lowest incomes, and those higher who can afford it start to contribute more to their childcare. And I think that's again a conversation for the next Parliament that's going to become more and more prevalent, that we're not going to be able to just tack on stuff to 1140. Like with Scottish Child Payment, we might not just be able to all campaign for the same next £10 or whatever. It might need to prioritise within the priority families, which will be uncomfortable for all of us, but it's exactly where we're going to need to be. The magnitude of the challenge, I think, was mentioned, and I often think about this. Whenever I'm in front of Social Justice Security Committee, I always get asked, well, how are you going to pay for this? You're going to cut education, you're going to cut whatever. And it's a bit irritating, because what I think is, you all signed up to this 10% of child poverty. Did you not realise how radical a change that is to society to have that much of a poverty reduction? And the fact that we're now entering the last parliamentary term of the child poverty targets obviously means there's much more work to do. But if we want to get there, and every politician who was in Parliament at the time signed up to do it, and since every leader have had to look at this has affirmed their position and their commitment to reducing child poverty, we need to be radical about the way we redistribute incomes within Scotland. And that includes social security, but it includes increases in taxes or reductions in rate reliefs from non-domestic rates, and a whole host of very difficult conversations that might also include public sector pay. Public sector in Scotland has had a phenomenal performance in reducing in-work poverty in its own ranks. The pay awards have been very well won and fought for, but maybe we need to bank some of that good progress we've made and prioritise again further parents who are in poverty. And just lastly, that trade-off has already been made by the First Minister the other way around. When we looked at the Parental Employment Support Fund and the £53 million that was meant to come into it, that was cut in aid of public sector pay deals. A legitimate political decision, but a political decision to prioritise that over child poverty. So if this is number one priority, then I think we need to be willing to face some of those very difficult conversations with our colleagues in unions and our colleagues in the public sector. And the last thing, sorry, just to focus on, other than just getting people into work, improving work and making work better is such a fundamental part of this. We have an issue in Scotland with persistent low pay, so people paid below the real living wage for the last 5 years, which is about 11% of the workforce. 70% of that chunk of people are women. So there's this kind of key blocker of people progressing, and we also know which industries these people are in as well. And any kind of industrial strategy needs to focus on those industries, the economy we have, not just the economy we want to have. So looking at retail, hospitality, as the Fraser have done in the past. But yeah, that's okay.
Thank you, Jack. And Suzanne.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to start by saying how brilliant those presentations were from the Institute as well. I mean, it's just really a kind of capacity to distill down such complex material into something that we, you know, that's so easily graspable and so important in framing these very difficult debates. I mean, I maybe want to do slightly the opposite of Russell and start with the optimistic and get to the info of politics out in a way, because I think that there is a tendency, not just in child poverty discussions, but also in my kind of day job work, which is around homelessness, in failing to acknowledge how well Scotland is doing in lots of ways. And that's not, you know, of course, the concern with that is it can come over as complacent and so on. Of course, there's a long way to go. But it isn't just modelling against the counterfactual that you can see the impact that the Scottish child payments had. Look at what's happening down south. You know, that would be, to some extent, at least the world we would be in if the Scottish Government had not taken what are pretty brave steps, albeit perhaps a little bit in the background, to concentrate on those resources on addressing child poverty. And so we have, you know, we have actually achieved a lot. A lot of people in this room have been part of that. We also do start with some advantages in Scotland, and a lot of them are actually in housing, which again is part of my day job. I mean, one of the reasons why Scotland has consistently had a lower level of child poverty than England is because we have got a large and cheaper social housing sector, and that takes a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of, excuse me, taking us to, you know, our relatively lower levels of child poverty. So there's a lot that we've achieved. I would also like to speak up for targets. I mean, whether or not we reach this target, I think the target itself is incredibly important, and the fact that it's in legislation, the fact that we can use it, all of us that care about child poverty, as a constant lever to hold feet to the fire really matters. Targets don't matter just if you achieve them, they matter for the motivating impact that they have. So I think there's a lot to be proud of and a lot to be positive about in what we've done and what we've achieved so far. But I suppose there's two, I mean, I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have said because I agree very much, obviously, with, you know, there's an awful long way to go, and it's all very, very tough in terms of what the choices are that we have. But one thing I would like to emphasise is this isn't just about the Scottish Government. This is Scotland's targets. These aren't the Scottish Government's targets, albeit, of course, First Ministers have adopted them and said it's their number one priority. Successive First Ministers have done that. But actually all the political parties, at least all those that are in the Parliament at the moment, have signed up to these targets. So I think that, you know, this isn't just about having to go to the Scottish Government, it's actually also asking all of the other political parties to have grown-up conversations about these tough asks, both around policy, around tax and income raising, but also around distribution and spending as well. And in that, I think we haven't done very well. I think there's been some very disappointing things that have happened, both from the Scottish Government and from other political parties in recent years. And my colleagues in the Poverty Commission won't be surprised to hear me pick out one particular example, which is just how disappointing it was what happened around the winter fuel payment and the extent to which political parties, including the Scottish Government and the SNP, made political sort of used that as a political football rather than really getting behind the fact that the Labour government had made the right decision on that, to focus on need, not on age. And frankly, if you're going to pick an age group, then pick the age group that is in higher levels of poverty. Don't pick the age group that is less poor. So, you know, there was, I mean, in terms of making a decision and getting behind the politics of something that was very, very, that is actually pro-poor and pro-reaching the targets, that was very disappointing from the Scottish Government and indeed from across the political spectrum around that. So I think that does tell us something about what the challenges are that we face. But I also think, and it's a bit like going to your point about the unions, I think civil society as well. I mean, I think, again, the example of the winter fuel payment, I was very disappointed in a lot of Scotland's civil society around that too, and not actually getting behind the fact that if we are serious about these child poverty targets, we have to look at these cash transfers, which are not pro-poor, which are not progressive, and ask whether we can spend that money better. I think it's also true of other universal type cash transfers or subsidies, or even more so things which are effectively middle class subsidies. So, you know, concessionary travel for over 60s and indeed for under 22s. Things like tuition fees for university students, and I hope nobody from my Heriot Watt University is in the room when I say that. you know, I think we have to look at even things like free school meals. I mean, I haven't seen the evidence of just, you know, that's going to take us very far in terms of meeting child poverty targets. So, you know, tax, yes, of course, is part of it. We've heard from a number of colleagues just how long-term and structural it is and how difficult it is to get tax changes to really take us towards the targets. I think we have to look at changes in expenditure. I think we have to look at much more targeted approaches. And some of those, I mean, I think health is very difficult, but I think within education and transport, for example, we should be looking at redirecting some of those subsidies at the moment. To do that, you can't expect the Scottish Government or any one political party to take all the political heat on that. It will take a cross-party effort, and it will take civil society in Scotland also being a bit more grown up and actually getting behind not just their particular sectoral interests, but actually seeing this as, you know, Scotland, you know, an emblem of the society we want to live in. The very final point I'm making is it's not just because one of the key architects this year is just how excited I am about the minimum income guarantee. I think that, I mean, we know it would make this massive difference if we got you know, substantially down that road in terms of closing that gap. But I think it's just emblematic also that in society I want to live in, a civilised society where we establish a floor below which nobody falls. And that's the kind of universalism I want to get behind, rather than universalism in terms of inputs, it's universalism in terms of outcome. And that's universal, that's the kind of outcome I think that an anti-poverty, serious anti-poverty strategy should be getting behind. So I'll wait for that.
Thank you all three of you for your initial responses. Some really interesting points in there to pick up on, lots of things going on that we should definitely talk about. So one thing I'd like to pick up on first, Suzanne, you mentioned about the idea of parties need to work together, and the Scottish Government has this responsibility. And that ties quite well into something we've heard about in previous sessions about sort of short-termism and versus long-term versus preventative policy. So I wonder if we could maybe have a little bit of a discussion about how do we prioritise short-term versus long-term versus preventative, and what are your views, the three of you, on how we do that? So do you want to come to that first? Do you want to?
Yeah, if you like. We'll
go backwards.
Go backwards. I mean, obviously, I mean, the usual answer to that is let's focus on the long term and prevention and so on. And you know, I talk about that all the time in my day job again, in homelessness. But with her, but you know, people are living in poverty now, and the targets are for 2030. And I think that we do, you know, in an ideal world, we want poverty, child poverty, and all forms of poverty to be, or certainly all forms of working age poverty to be resolved largely through the labour market, so that people have the dignity of having the income they require to live a decent life through their labour. I mean, we don't want, I certainly wouldn't want, I don't, my ideal world is not one in which we're relying really heavily on social security transfers, so those sort of transfers to correct for gross inequality in the labour market. But that is a long-term strategic goal which is not within our grasp anytime soon. It's also very expensive, as we were hearing, to try and make that happen. So while I completely support doing what we can, and particularly the Scottish Government using the levers it's got in the labour market to make the biggest difference it can, I think that it's not good enough for the children growing up in poverty now to rely on those things which are very long term. So that's where we do need those short term priorities, and there is no getting away from it. That is social security transfers, and it's social security transfers which are targeted on families in poverty or at risk of poverty. And within that, for me, particularly the families who are furthest or in the deepest poverty, furthest away from being able to live a decent life. And that includes families, for example, experiencing no recourse to public funds, not just British citizens in my view. So yes, the long-term preventative work, which is what, you know, in our different ways, I think we're all working on, is really, really important. But, you know, the here and now really matters too. And yeah, so maybe that's a bit of a non-answer, but I definitely, you know, I don't think it's one of those areas we can say we should put all our eggs in the long-term basket. I think we really do need to focus on here and now as well.
Jack?
Can I give a non-answer too?
Of course.
I suppose I think it's not all child poverty policy long-term policy. I know we've got the 2030 targets. That feels like short term, but I mean, I care about the 10% child poverty rate, but what I care about more is the impact of children not being in poverty and how that's going to kind of affect them through their lives. And that's what we should be starting to kind of also consider in terms of we're approaching the end of these targets is what's that kind of longitudinal impact of families growing up with more income than they would have done otherwise. So that's part of my thinking on it. But I suppose the other part is long-term versus short-term. I suppose either one for Scottish Government, for me, the most important part is like the evidence-based policy making. And often that doesn't feel like where we're always at. So I think we were, if you're looking at adult disability payment and labour market inactivity, we're not doing the best job of understanding why we're increasing. The claimant count is increasing, and how you can marry that up with labour market interventions as well as employability support. So I get why the argument is there, whereas cash transfers are thought of as short term, but I don't think that's the framing for child poverty that I kind of see.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's almost kind of, you're almost flipping it and saying that if we think of these long-term policies and then the longitudinal impacts of those, child poverty policies are almost becoming preventative policies for other issues. So
I think what it is like, it says maybe it's trite, but if you're investing in children, you're investing in the future. And the kind of future of Scotland that we want to grow up in. The story that we're trying to tell is one which has far fewer, 100,000 fewer kids growing up in poverty, which then should make a big difference on their kind of outcomes later on.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it does get miscategorized or characterized, particularly by those that are currently worrying about how to, so maybe even Michael Meyer earlier today in a different arena would be saying opposite to what I'm saying, but it gets mischaracterized. The spending on social security is somehow cheating. This isn't the real way to end poverty or reduce poverty. The real way to do that is more sustainable, more preventative, through services, through education, through work, etc. You've seen the numbers. In the short term, over the next 5 years, you can see how much those can contribute. And there's other evidence too that actually money is just as preventative as services in terms of long-term outcomes. So I completely agree. I'm not saying we should put everything into social security. You heard me earlier. It's not what I think. But spending on social security is preventative spend, not just for children, but also for children. And we can act short-term, act now with a long-term aim in mind. Minimum income guarantee is an example of that. There are plenty of others. We can set out where we're aiming to get to in 20, 25 years. It doesn't mean we wait 20, 25 years to start making the steps towards it. So in the next 5 years, the steps towards the MIG, the steps towards the child poverty target, steps towards a fairer Scotland, one that actually can grow an economy that sustains itself as well. They're the same. They're about reducing inequality, and you can see from the numbers the most impactful ways to do that.
And so what needs to change for this to happen? Who are the decision makers? What are the barriers that you see?
I think it's Jack's turn to go first.
All right.
I think Russell kind of outlined it in his first answer. It's politics, right?
Yeah.
Like every decision that talks about spending is vicious at the moment. We're about to go into an election that's essentially fought on incumbency, whether that's the Labour Party, what they're going to do in their budget, or what the Scottish Government have done and are not doing in their budget over the last however many years they've been in power. So the idea that if we come up with an idea like I was thinking about, with non-domestic rates, they're worth £3 billion of income, but we also give away almost £800 million in rate relief. Well, let's start putting through businesses through the same amount of process to get that rate relief that individuals go through to get their social security payment. Now let's look at that evidence. That is not what the Scottish Government want to do to the business community at the moment. And I think we've got the business monitor coming out from the Fraser soon. There's been a huge effort made by Scottish Government to get closer to business, and it's probably working. But I don't know if that's aligned with what we're trying to do in child poverty. There needs to be a higher degree of enlightened self-interest between how we reduce poverty, how we get a good labour market, and how we increase labour market the economic productivity in Scotland. And some of that will be about tying conditions to rate relief, or some of that will be about getting business in earlier to talk about employability and employment support. But all of it does cost a bit of money and will cause a bit of pain. And I suppose that blocker is like, how willing are parties to not be glib and reactionary to the thought of putting pressure on either business or, more likely as well, middle income earners. What we've got at the moment is a tax base that already feels significantly under pressure, but also has a disproportionate idea of where it sits in the income distribution. So people think higher earners should pay more for tax, but they are higher earners. Probably will have to make any money out of the tax system without behavioural, stuff changing. People earning 40 grand, 50 grand are going to need to pay more tax, and that is nurses, doctors, teachers, the very people that will be very easy to attack an opposition politician for doing down. So I think that's the kind of challenge that we face, and I've not got like a super sunny outlook on how political discourse is going at the moment. But I think to kind of put in some hope on that, I guess there's a fork in the road. You can kind of go down the kind of reactionary, horrible scenes that we saw down south, the kind of rise of the right, because they're complaining about the same things that we're talking about, like in equal distributions, kind of not feeling that my job pays enough, I've not got a house. That's all legitimate concerns, but we need to then offer a kind of salient solution that we can kind of coalesce around as people that are not going to just blame immigrants for. So I think if there is the getting together of political thinking on that, and civil society, as you say, has a role to play in that. That's where I think we need to move.
Yeah, I was going to say, so the fix is massive and arguably overwhelming, as we've heard. The fix is invest in social security, scale up employability or fair work intervention, reshape the labour market so that employers, employees and government share a stake in it and think long term rather than short term. It's about knitting together public services so that rather than dancing with a system, which is what we heard about in the last session, you can navigate that system, or better still, you don't have to navigate. It's much more simple. All of these things are massive undertakings over a really long period of time. I see massive barriers to doing that, but we have to focus on them. Where I see much less or much lower barriers is where I sort of started earlier. If we break this down into more, how can we repeat what we've done over the last 5 years over this next 5, and maybe ideally add a bit more? That doesn't feel like a big, massive, overwhelming task. That feels like £130 million out of every budget for the next 5 years. If we're going into a very chaotic minority government context, that's doable. That is very doable. We would be not doing our jobs if we do not secure that. So the 650 million question feels, I hope I'm not, please don't record this and come back to me in 5 years' time. But it doesn't feel very undoable. The overall fix is generational, long-term. That feels very overwhelming, but we have to start and make progress chips off of that.
Well, I'm glad to hear some optimism in various ways from my colleagues here, because of course it's very difficult to feel optimistic about politics at the moment. I think particularly since last weekend, and I had just happened to be down south visiting family near Peterborough, and to actually go into one of these, a town just outside Peterborough, and literally see dozens of Union Jacks. I mean, it was genuinely a terrifying sight. And then just it being on campus in Edinburgh, where Herrick Watt's quite near some of the poorer parts of Edinburgh, and to see saltires up, and not in a good way, it's really quite scary at the moment. But I completely agree that actually some of what those malevolent forces are weaponizing is exactly the issues that we are concerned about, and I think we have a huge responsibility to provide a different path to resolving those things, and to dig deep and find a bit of optimism on this. I do think you can tap into a kind of a part of the Scottish psyche, which might be sort of a bit of an affectation, or even a bit of a kind of competition with England thing. But, you know, the whole idea that we're a solidaristic country, that actually we are a civilized country, that we don't think that we think that everybody should live a decent life and so on. I think there is something there that the MIG, for example, taps into at a sort of basic philosophical level. But I do think, you know, whether it's a bit of a conceit on the part of the Scottish public or not, and the British Social Attitude Survey would kind of question, I think, how different the Scottish psyche is in some of these things than we like to think we are. But traditionally, one of the things that we have had, whether you like it or not, is we have had a centre-left elite in terms of the universities, in terms of the civil service, in terms of the media and so on. So we start with some infrastructure to some ballast against some of what we're seeing down south that's so nasty, and I think we have to try and build on that. And the very fact that the child poverty targets are cross-party, that they have been, you can't just, you know, will the end but not the means. You know, I think we have to put pressure, and I was genuinely really disappointed in civil society's response and the union's response around the winter fuel payment. I thought, this is, if you can't get behind, you know, a redistribution of this, then, you know, what can we win? So I think a lot of it for me isn't just about the government or actually even the political parties, it's about the other players and setting that kind of I don't know what the Overton window is in Scotland. I think we all have a responsibility in some of those sectoral interests if we're serious about poverty, and child poverty is the one that people usually find easiest to get behind for lots of reasons. We might want to argue about working age poverty, which worries me a lot as well. But you know, I think there's potentially an opportunity there to dig deep within what has traditionally been a more progressive mindset, at least at elite levels in Scotland.
Thank you all. It's been such an interesting conversation. And now I want to give the audience some time to ask questions. So we have got someone that is helping with a roving mic. We've got a gentleman over here. If we could try and keep questions and answers brief, as we've got 10 minutes left, so we'll try and fit as many in as we can.
I'll try and be brief. Mick Wilson from Scottish Government. Unsurprisingly, I agree with the vast majority of what we've heard, although I might refer Suzanne to a conversation with our lawyers about the value of targets and whether they're there to encourage or to be met, but that's for another day. I think one of the key things, you know, that comes across in all of this is just how bloody complicated all of this is, right through the kind of understanding what's going on and how it works and what we're spending and how policies interact and what their impact is, through to understanding the kind of potential and the impacts and the different avenues and routes that might be available to making some greater progress, particularly as Russell was saying, you know, in the kind of political environment, which at the moment in particular is, you know, feels really quite difficult, doesn't it? You know, just in terms of the debate. I think one thing, and I think Jack, it was yourself that mentioned this, you know, it's unfortunate, I think, that the debate hasn't moved more quickly into that more radical, you know, reimagining the future type space. Now, I know that's really hard. And as policymakers, whether that's politicians or officials, that's a really hard space to get into, because what the hell does that look like? And what do we mean? And how do we get from here to something else? But what we've shown systematically, I think, and the work that particularly that Tana was talking through, you know, we're not going to get there realistically through, you know, tweaks and changes to the current structures and the current system, right? I mean, potentially feasibly, yes, but, you know, in a way that we wouldn't want for other reasons, you know, massive amounts of payments through child payment or whatever it would happen to be. So I think it's disappointing that we haven't got to that point of a more radical discussion about what that might look like going forward. I think the final point, which is related, is about the debate that we see on sort of the value of the social security stuff. I guess it tends to be pinned in this kind of, you know, should it be social security or should it be something else? Which is most attractive? Do we want a world where people rely on social security and all the negative connotations that tends to come with, or something which is different? But what we're doing at the moment is, in the political debate at least, is pitching the social security offer against a pretty crappy employment offer for a lot of people. So, you know, if you're at that end of the income distribution, you know, Jack, your work's looked at the sectors that people are concentrated in, you know, that is really low quality work, you know, low security work, it is low paid work, you know, part-time, etc., etc. And I think that is not the right comparison for us to be making in terms of the potential value of a social security type safety net and a pay one. It's interesting if you look at other countries where they do this rather well. Sorry, I'm shouting at the mic. Where they do this rather well, they have a very different attitude and approach to that, a very different kind of reference point. So it would be good if that could get into the debate a little bit more, I think, about how we model this going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll maybe take another question as well, and then I'll come back to you guys. So we've got a question up here.
My name's Finney Almond. I'm from the children's charity Magic Breakfast. It's a short question. If you could add one policy into the new, well, supposedly it exists, UK government child poverty strategy, if you could add just one policy into that that would help the Scottish government to meet the child poverty targets, what would you add in?
Right, is it back to me? I think it might be. I think that one is two-child limit across the UK, free up 200 million quid, throw it wherever we like, whether it's into work, whether it's into Scottish Child Payment, whether it's into some of the other places, because that's how the interaction, as you heard earlier, can be really helpful, where you see progress across the UK. That can free up money in Scotland to reinvest and make progress even quicker. And in terms of your point, Mike, I think I just agree mainly, except I'd say that making steps over the next 5 years in the direction of where we want to get to over the next 20 can actually lead to quite quick progress. So overnight stuff is going to be really difficult in the context, but really quite fast-paced change over a more 5 to 10 year period might be much more possible.
I'm just sorry, but yeah, I mean, the two-child limit is absolutely the answer on your question, but not only because of the practical impact, but I think just because it's such a heinous policy. I think just seeing that end, I mean, I remember back in 2010, 2011, when it was being discussed when the coalition came to power, and I literally couldn't believe they were serious about it, you know. But the problem we've got is it's very popular, as I understand it. The general public likes the policy, which is not very encouraging. But I do think, again, it's somewhere where the you know, civil society, not just people who have an interest in child poverty, but just more generally people that are interested in pushing a progressive, you know, civilized world, just say that this is just not an acceptable policy. And so, yeah, it would definitely be the one I would want to see. And to be fair, it's the one that most people, including Labour backbenchers, would want to see changed, I think.
So you don't want Meg? No.
I mean, it's a step towards it. It's a step. It's on the roadmap. Year 1 to 5, I think you'll find.
Okay. The only one. So yeah, pound for pound, two-child limit. Get it shot. That is the most effective way to reduce child poverty. But if I was saying something different, it would be about tying the value of social security to the needs of people rather than it just being relatively arbitrary. So we've got a campaign with the Trussell Trust around the Essentials Guarantee, which means that you basically, it's not too dissimilar from an idea of Meg, that if you're on social security, you have enough to live on, which just sounds straightforward, but it's quite expensive. On the point around work, I guess what we've not talked about too much is the depth of poverty and how that's changed. So we focus on the top line of relative poverty, which has kind of been steady / going down a wee bit. The depth of poverty, so very deep poverty, has become more prevalent within child poverty. So in 1997, 1 in 5 kids in poverty were in very deep poverty. Now it's 1 in 3 kids in poverty are in very deep poverty. And that's a huge gap. So if you're in poverty, say in a 2-person household with 2 primary school aged kids, and you're in poverty, you're £160 away from the poverty line. That same family who's in very deep poverty is £1,160 away from the poverty line. You're not going to get that gap closed alone with social security. You need the labour market to play a role, but the nature of those families are often going to be the ones that are often referred to as being far away from the labour market. It's the labour market that's far away from them, to be honest. But that needs to be addressed, because we can't reach the child poverty targets without, now because of the proliferation of very deep poverty, we need to address very deep poverty as well. The labour market has to be a part of that, because the security system can't handle it.
Thank you. Any more questions? For a lady.
Hi, thanks. It's been really interesting. I'm curious as to why there has been probably less discussion of the sort of pre-distribution. I'm not sure if I've kind of made up this term, but sort of pre-distribution as opposed to redistribution. So I think all day it's been about how the states can correct for an unequal economy, so how the outputs of the economy are shared, assets, wages, production. And it feels that we are scrapping around with trying to resolve issues with a smaller and smaller pot of a public spend. I'm curious as to if there's an appetite or an interest in looking at the sort of pre-distribution aspects of the economy.
And we'll take one more question just before we finish as well. We've one here.
No, thank you. Very impressive presentations and discussion. It's more a reflection, but a bit of a question on the back of it. I mean, I was very taken by Russell's kind of taking a political approach. As a campaign, I'm from Child Poverty Action Group, campaigning organisation committed to whole purpose about ending child poverty. Also, Jack's kind of actually realistically to get to a point where you have sustained zero poverty, actually we get that requiring quite radical change. I suppose my reflection is I think we can try and do both over the next 5 years, that we do need to be looking at how can we realistically, pragmatically secure what I think are winnable amounts of money that can actually at least repeat the kind of impact we've had over the last 5 years, but at the same time as that, continue to be making the case for the more fundamental redistribution use of tax powers. So I suppose the question on that is how, any thoughts on how we most effectively kind of do that for those of us that are kind of campaigners and are trying to bring about the pressure that will actually create that kind of change, getting that balance between winnable shorter term investments that are actually part of the long term preventative approach, but also bringing about the bigger changes that will be needed for long term sustained low levels of child poverty.
Thank you. Yeah, go for it.
So pre-distribution and redistribution, that's what the two last questions are on. So I think on pre-distribution, I didn't use the term, but when you're talking about reforming the labour market, when you're talking about balancing power between employers, employees and the state, that's exactly the types of things you need to do to get your labour market fairer in the first place, so that you need to do less redistribution following. But there isn't a country on planet Earth that has zero child poverty rates through labour market alone. You need social security for rent, for disability, for children, for lower incomes, lower paid, and even more so when the labour market strength is as low as what we have here. So I agree, it was sort of embedded but not explicit. The other point would be, in a 5-year time period, pre-distribution is going to be really, really tricky to achieve, particularly with the powers that the Scottish Parliament has. To me, it's more of a longer term but laudable and more than laudable objective. Redistribution, it just feels politically, and this is a subjective judgment, and campaigners and others need to push to make my subjective judgment. You don't need to make my judgment different, but to make sure I'm wrong. But it doesn't have to feel like the politicians in Scotland, and look at the makeup of the next parliament, likely feel like they've used the income tax lever as far as they can for now. I'm not sure I agree, but politically it feels like a really tough ask to be pushing further on that. Where you can raise money, though, is if the UK government begin to cut income taxes and we hold them as they are, which might look to be going the opposite direction of that. So we may be actually having to raise income taxes just to stand still if, maybe not in November, but in future budgets, the UK government are forced to move on on the taxes that are to hold. So it just feels tough. I'd like it to happen, but that political lens makes it feel tougher than the last 5 years looking ahead.
On John's point, I was wondering in Hannah's presentation if we need to dust off the Give Me 5 campaign, but make it 5 billion rather than 5.7. So that's part of the joke, but I think what happened with the Scottish Child Payment is an example of how we need to approach the next 5 years, and that's sector coherence, tactically engaging with the parties in a way that made the Scottish Child Payment and the child poverty targets come about, and I think that we should all kind of be working for that together.
If I just come back on the pre-distribution point, because I think it is a really important point, and we know from sort of international comparative research, I think actually the work that the government commissioned, that actually the social security system does a lot of redistribution. I mean, proportionately, it carries a lot of weight, and in the UK, not just in Scotland. And that's partly because our pre-distribution, to use that term, is so bad. So I think it speaks to kind of a point that I feel quite strongly about as well, is that we absolutely do need, we always will need social security for all the reasons Russell said, and in any case we need it, because there will always be reasons why people can't earn what they need in the labour market. And also I think we just all want, it's a bit like the NHS, we want to live in a world where we have that security, knowing that if for whatever reason we weren't able to, then we could still live a decent life. So I think that social security is always going to be very, very important, but it's probably it is more important than we ideally want it to be at the moment, because the kind of the pre-tax and redistribution intervention, distribution of incomes is so unequal. So I think that is really important. As Russell said, it's a long-term thing. It's also partly it's economics, but it's also culture. You know, the UK is different from some of these northwestern European countries that we tend to compare ourselves to. I wish we were more like them. I'm doing some work in Norway at the moment, and they're both rich and fairly equal, which is a very nice place to be. And it would be lovely if we were more like Norway. But I do think it's a long-term agenda that we shouldn't forget about. But in the shorter term, there's no getting away from the importance of social security and cash transfers, but I do think they have to be more targeted than some of the cash transfers that the Scottish Government has prioritised in recent years.
Well, that's been such a good conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I'd just like to thank all of our speakers and our panelists one more time. Thank you so much.